Okay, my name is Barry. Middle initial N as in Nelson. That's no joke. I was named after my grandfather, Nelson. Barry Nelson. My last name is Wood. We're recording this on June 14th, 2006. June 14, 2006, at my home at 405 Linda Lane in Houston, Pennsylvania. And I have two stories to share with you about Nelson Eddy and Jeanette MacDonald's sister, Blossom Rock. I became a Jeanette MacDonald fan when I was still a teenager and saw the movie Maytime and cried like a baby and turned to my parents and said, "Who are Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy?" And that's how I became involved. And then after I graduated from high school, I went to a business college, and about the 1961, I went to Washington, D.C., where I was employed with the Veterans Administration for about 6 years. Anyway, while I was living in Washington, D.C., there was a picture in the Washington paper of Jeanette MacDonald with a socialite named Mrs. Herbert May. And I wrote to Mrs. May and asked about Jeanette. She was very kind and wrote me back and said she couldn't give me Jeanette's home address, but she would forward my letter to Jeanette MacDonald in Los Angeles. She did that, and much to my surprise, Jeanette MacDonald wrote me back and suggested that I join the club that was active at that time, which was the Jeanette MacDonald International Fan Club, which I joined immediately, of course. In January of early 61, not January, but in early 1961-62, Nelson Eddy came through Washington, D.C. He was making, I think it may have been his first round with his new singing partner, Gail Sherwood. And they were appearing at the Shoreham room, the Blue Room at the Shoreham Hotel in Washington, D.C. I had just been recently employed by the Veterans Administration and couldn't afford the price of the performance, but I could not let the chance go by to at least communicate with Nelson Eddy my being such a fan. So I don't know where I got the chutzpah, but I picked up the telephone and I dialed the Shoreham Hotel. I asked to talk to Mr. Eddy. They said, "Who's calling, please?" And I said, I thought for a second, and then I said, "Mr. Wood." And they said, "Just a moment," and the phone rang, and the voice answered, "Hello." I said, "I'd like to speak to Nelson Eddy," and he said, "Speaking," and like a silly little teenage fan, I said, "Oh, is this really Nelson Eddy?" And he said, "Yes, it is. What can I do for you?" And I introduced myself. I explained my situation, how I couldn't afford the price, but, you know, how much I loved his films, especially the ones with Jeanette MacDonald. And I would love to meet him in person, but unfortunately I couldn't afford the show price. So Mr. Eddy was nice enough, I couldn't believe this, to invite me out to the Shoreham the very next day to meet him about late afternoon before his performance later that evening. My sister was also working in D.C., Maxine. She's 2 years younger than me, and so it was all new to her, but she was also a fan and begged me to take her with her. So the next day, I was to meet my sister, and we were to go out after work and meet Mr. Eddy. Unfortunately, she was late, and from the time the two of us connected till we got to the Shoreham, I knew we were late. So we walked into the Shoreham Hotel, went to the front desk, asked for Mr. Eddy. They said he was eating in the Garden Restaurant. So we went to the Garden Restaurant. I talked to the maitre d', introduced myself, and said Mr. Eddy was expecting us. Of course, at this time I realized that had we been on time, we probably would have been able to eat with Mr. Eddy himself. Anyway, the maitre d' disappeared. I was very nervous and as well as excited. The maitre d' came out and said, "Mr. Eddy said to tell you he'll be with you in a moment and you're late." Well, you know, I was still thrilled and excited, and that's when I realized had we been early enough, we may have been able to dine with him. Anyway, in about, a minute later, Nelson Eddy came walking out. Gail Sherwood was directly behind him. He came out, he was the nicest gentleman, introduced himself and Gail Sherwood to my sister and myself. We walked them to the elevator. Gail Sherwood went up to wherever room she was staying, and Mr. Eddy walked us into the lobby of the Shoreham Hotel, where he sat down with my sister and I and talked to us for about 30 minutes. I was very sensitive to Mr. Eddy because I was really a Jeanette fan, and I tried not to focus on her, at least not to bring Jeanette up for a few minutes. And we talked about the movies, his career, voice control, that sort of thing. And then I brought up Jeanette MacDonald and how is she doing? And the very first thing he said, she's doing very well. As a matter of fact, I just talked to her on the phone last night. At the time, I didn't think anything of it because you have to remember I was young and uneducated with regard to the MacDonald-Eddy affair. Oh, if I had only known the questions I would have asked, because for me, I wanted them to be together, as I'm sure they are now. But unfortunately, like most of the public, I was completely unaware of the truth behind the relationship between the two of them. He took time to give us autographs, and I wish now that in thinking back, I could remember more about what we talked about. But I remember when I first saw him, of course, he looked older than his films, but he looked just as handsome as ever with that great mane of hair, and that baritone voice was just exquisite. It was Nelson Eddy. And when we were finished, we walked him to the elevator, and oh my, at that point, I thought I had many, many years in which I would have an opportunity to meet Jeanette. Little did I know she would die about 4 years later in 1965. So that's my Nelson Eddy experience. Now, what happened, as you all know, Jeanette died in January of 1965. Her sister Blossom Rock, at that time, was employed with a television role with the Addams Family doing the role of Granny. Well, in Washington, D.C., every April, they have a huge Cherry Blossom Festival parade. And this year, 1965, in April of 1965, I read in the paper where the entire Addams Family cast were the grand marshals of the parade. And I thought about going out to meet them, just to meet Jeanette MacDonald's sister, but then I thought, no. And then I thought, Barry, how crazy. If Jeanette MacDonald were in town, you would be there with all the flowers in the world. So I said, I'm going. And I had a bouquet of flowers. I found out when they would be arriving. I was waiting in the lobby of the Shoreham when their limos pulled up. They all came out, the entire cast, and I waited until I saw Blossom. And I walked up to Blossom and I introduced myself. I explained right away that I was a member of the Jeanette MacDonald International Fan Club and a huge fan of her sister's. Well, she gave me a hug. I gave her the flowers. I don't remember what we talked about, but I think she said something like, wait a minute, come with me while I check in at the front desk. Well, of course, sure, I'll be happy to do. We went to the front desk and she checked in, made sure that all her luggage would be sent to the right room. And then she turned to me and said, come on, you're coming with me, or how would you like to come upstairs and we can talk a while? Well, of course, Miss Rock, I'd be happy to. So I literally went up the elevator in the Shoreham Hotel with Blossom. We went to her room. I'll never forget, I wish I could remember what we talked about. I definitely remember sitting in a chair. She was on the other side of the bed, which was located in the middle of the room, and she was unpacking her suitcase. And while we were talking, she continued to unpack her suitcase and hang everything up. We were only there for about maybe 5, 10, 15 minutes, and then she said, have you had anything to eat? Would you like to go downstairs and eat, because Gordon MacRae was appearing with his wife Sheila MacRae in the Blue Room at the Shoreham Hotel at the time they had checked in. Well, a little green behind the ears, I thought, sure, I'd be glad to, but of course all I could think about was how much money did I have in my wallet and how expensive was the Blue Room. I didn't know any better, of course, but that's what was going through my head. But I wasn't going to miss the opportunity to have lunch with Jeanette MacDonald's sister, Blossom. So we did go into the Blue Room. We ordered. for some reason, I don't remember what Miss Rock ordered, but I must have ordered something because I was trying to keep the price down for myself. I think I ordered a club sandwich or something. It wasn't, I was too excited. I remember a couple tables away from us sat the entire Addams Family cast, and was it Jackie Cooper Jackie Coogan, Jackie Cooper, and the whole cast waved to me and said hello and so forth. And again, I just cannot remember a single thing that Blossom and I talked about, but we talked the whole night. Gordon McRae came out and did his floor show. Sheila was committed to something else in New York, so she didn't make the show. After the show, of course, the funny part here that I don't want to forget is the bill finally did come. I don't think I ever looked at it because Blossom picked it up, signed it, and obviously the television studio paid the bill in full. So all my sitting there all that time worrying about this check. This was before I had credit cards or anything like that. But I remember laughing with Blossom and talking. And I know we talked about Jeanette MacDonald, and she was never hesitant about talking about Jeanette. You could tell by her talking about her sister, how close they were and how much she loved her, and I'm sure missed her. When it was over, I escorted Miss Rock to the elevator, and when I went home that night, I wrote her a lovely thank you note, had it delivered to the showroom along with a corsage, an orchid corsage, to personally thank her. I mean, you have to understand what this meant to me, to meet Jeanette's sister. I'm getting emotional now. And I'm sorry, you know, of course, that I never had the opportunity to meet Jeanette. And several days later, in April of 1965, from California, I received a charming handwritten note back from Blossom Rock thanking me for taking the time, what a lovely time she had, thanking me for escorting her to the Gordon McRae concert, and thanking me especially for the orchid, which she said she wore in the Cherry Blossom Festival Parade that night. She said in her handwritten note that she took it back to California with her, and it almost made it to another occasion that she was to appear at. I don't remember which one it was, so that's how I happened to meet Blossom Rock and, of course, the great Nelson Eddy. Unfortunately, when Jeanette died, I was working. The night she died, I got a phone call from a friend, and of course I was stunned. After hours of crying, I ran out and got all the newspapers, you know. When I called my boss the next morning to get off, before I could say anything, he could tell from my voice, and they knew what an addict I was. He said, "You don't have to say a word. We understand. Don't come into work today." But again, I was out on the streets of D.C. trying to get every newspaper I could. And so that's my close association with Jeanette MacDonald. And once I had her home address, I did write to her several times. And she was always gracious enough to write back. So that's my Jeanette MacDonald story, my Nelson Eddy story, and my Blossom Rock story.